Hello, I'm Garry Stevens, and welcome to the History in the Bible podcast. All the history, in all the books, in all the Bibles. Episode 1.6, Canaan of the Patriarchs. Hello, and welcome back to the History in the Bible podcast. In this episode, I'll present a potted history of the Middle East in the period that the Bible covers in the books of Genesis through Judges. You can find some great charts and maps to help you at my website, www.historyinthebible.com. Recorded history begins about 3200 BC, with the first cities in Mesopotamia constructed by the Sumerians, an enigmatic people whose language we cannot link to any other. We next have records for Egypt from about a century later. The pyramids were built about 2600 BC. Archaeologists call this the Early Bronze Age, the age when humanity started to build cities and to write and to work metals. Around the periphery of Mesopotamia, the lands were occupied by Semites, a collection of peoples speaking any of a group of closely related languages: Arabic, Hebrew, Akkadian, Amorite, Aramaean, Canaanite. Again and again through the centuries, the Fertile Crescent would be overrun by Semitic waves, emerging from either Arabia or Syria. It is now thought that in most ancient times, perhaps 3,000 years before the Sumerians laid stylus to clay tablet, the Semites emigrated from drought-stricken North Africa through the Nile Valley and onwards east. The first great Semitic conqueror was Sargon the Great, who claimed to have been rescued from a floating basket in a river. Around 2250 BC, he seized control of the Sumerian cities and established the world's first empire, the Empire of Akkad, which stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. His successors maintained control for a century until the Sumerians briefly reasserted themselves at the end of the Early Bronze Age, in what is known as the Third Dynasty of Ur. Our interest with Canaan begins in the Middle Bronze Age, the period from 2000 to 1500 BC, the period of the Patriarchs according to the Bible. Rabbinical tradition dates Abraham's birth to 1976 BC, at the very beginning of the period. At that time, the Sumerian city-states that founded civilization were still flourishing, but were run by yet another wave of Semitic immigrants, the Amorites. The Amorite patchwork of city-states extended across the entire Fertile Crescent and through Canaan to the borders of Egypt. They were able to survive independently because there were no great empires that could threaten them. Only Middle Kingdom Egypt could be reckoned a power, but its rulers were preoccupied with reasserting their own authority over the two lands after the collapse of the Old Kingdom. If the Patriarchs did indeed live in the Middle Bronze Age Canaan, they would have enjoyed a period of prosperity. The Amorite cities were surrounded by huge fortifications, with ramparts built to defend against the battering rams of enemies. The local rulers embellished their cities with large-scale public buildings, temples and palaces, and planned them with paved streets at right angles. The larger cities would have had small forces of the latest military wonder weapon, the chariot. Making their appearance for the first time in this period were the cities of Ashur on the upper Tigris and Babylon further south. Both were founded by Akkadians, another Semitic people, and both would soon spend centuries struggling for control of the Middle East. But at this time, they were just typical city-states. Somewhere around 1700 BC, Egypt was invaded by the Hyksos, Semites from Canaan. Or perhaps they just emigrated en masse, we don't really know. They established control in the Nile Delta region, but were unable to oust the native dynasties from the south. At about the same time, Hammurabi, king of Babylon, he of the library and the laws, brought all Mesopotamia under his sway. His empire was short-lived, but he established Babylon as the great city of southern Mesopotamia, a dignity it would enjoy for more than 1,000 years. At the end of the Middle Bronze Age, around 1550 BC, Egypt expelled the Hyksos, chasing them into Canaan. This is the start of the final great period of Egyptian power, the New Kingdom. Wreaking vengeance for 150 years of foreign domination, the Egyptians laid waste to the land of their oppressors, destroying perhaps half of all the towns in Canaan. Some cities were rebuilt soon, but many were abandoned. Those that continued occupation during the Late Bronze Age were more modest than their Middle Bronze Age predecessors. Only Hatzor, largest of Canaan's cities, really flourished in the centuries of the Late Bronze Age. And this was not the only calamity that Canaan endured, for it was in the grip of a great series of droughts. Agriculture in the already marginal highlands was devastated, small villages abandoned. Bandits, sometimes called Aparu or Habaru in the Egyptian records, roamed the hills. The Egyptians brought devastation with their invasion, but after their conquests they also brought grain and the only hope of stability. Without grain, the villagers of the highlands had nothing to trade with the desert nomads. We have now arrived at the Late Bronze Age. This is usually dated from 1550 BC to the Great Collapse in 1200 BC. In the early decades of the age, armies of Egypt's new kingdom continued to push north. Their imperial ambitions in northern Syria were stymied by the kingdom of the Mitanni, a nation of unknown ethnic origin, perhaps Indo-European, perhaps not. The Mitanni had carved out a domain sandwiched between two small kingdoms, the Hittites in northwestern Anatolia and Babylon, now run by the Kassites of Indo-European stock. Egypt was left with Canaan, which it ruled with a more or less benign hand. The Canaanite cities were no longer the fortified bastions of the Middle Bronze Age, because their Egyptian masters wanted to ensure that rebellions could be quickly quashed. In return for giving up their independence, the cities joined a vast international community, trading by sea with Minoan Crete, Mycenaean Greece and Cyprus. In addition to the city and village dwellers, a widespread nomadic population known as the Shasa lived in the countryside, the mountain regions and the desert fringe. In times of drought and crisis, the Shasa would often raid the settled areas. By 1350 BC, Egypt's northern foe was no longer the Mitanni, but their conquerors the Hittites, an Indo-European people who established dominion over all Anatolia. Amongst their other accomplishments, the Hittites invented international diplomacy and the idea of international treaties and agreements. During the Late Bronze Age, the Canaanite coastal strip was contested by the Egyptian and Hittite kingdoms. The two empires reached a rapprochement, with the lion's share of the Levant going to Egypt. Across the sea, Mycenaean civilization flourished in Greece, sending its pottery across the known world. Mightiest of the cities of the Levant, and its northernmost point, at the border between the Hittites and the Egyptian domains, was the Mediterranean port city of Ugarit. As I discussed in episode 1.5, excavations at Ugarit have provided us with a wealth of information about the period. Ugarit had a huge bureaucracy, working from a lavish scriptorium where the clay was prepared and the tablets were made. Hundreds of their texts have survived. Here was a multilingual community, one educated by its trading. Ugarit's accountants used a 26-letter cuneiform alphabet. This invention would take writing out of the atmosphere of the ancient temples, away from the obscurities of the pictographs, into a secular, popular script, which people of many different nations could easily adapt. It was a direct forerunner of modern Western alphabets, as well as Biblical Hebrew. It is in the Late Bronze Age that biblical tradition places the Exodus. The rabbis held to a date of precisely 1476 BC, at the beginning of the Late Bronze Age. As I mentioned in episode 1.4, that was also the period in which the pioneering archaeologist John Garstang had dated his discoveries at Jericho, first city conquered by the Israelites. John Garstang is little remembered today, his achievements swamped by those of the American scholar William Foxwell Albright, a man 15 years his junior. Albright worked only briefly in the field as an archaeologist in the 1930s, but he was a polymath. He mastered dozens of ancient languages and religions and writings. He calculated ancient chronologies. He refined the dating of pottery and pioneered techniques and methods that are used still today. He founded whole research institutes and entire journals. Over 60 years of publication until his death in 1971, more than 1,000 papers and books. He established himself as the towering figure in Middle Eastern studies. Albright was a Protestant Christian who deeply believed that archaeology could validate the history in the Bible, because the religious value of the Bible lay in its testimony to divine acts in history. Again and again he hammered home his position. The Bible was a reliable guide to the history of the Israelites, and that was confirmed by archaeological excavations. He and his students defended the assumption that the biblical text was reliable by asserting that a text could be considered historically reliable if its details were plausible. The personal names, marriage customs, and land purchase laws all seemed to fit other information we had from Middle Bronze Age Mesopotamia, the land of Abraham's birth, Ur of the Chaldees, as Genesis puts it. No less important, the patriarchs were realistically depicted in the Bible as having a Bedouin lifestyle. And it all slotted in rather nicely with the Bible's chronology, which placed Jacob's descent into Egypt 910 years before Solomon. That would put Jacob sometime in the 19th century, right where Albright's ideas said it should be. To add icing to the cake, the Israelites would have spent their 480 years in Egypt during the time of the Hyksos, who were definitely identified as Semites. But Albright could not justify Garstang's date of the fall of Jericho to about 1400 BC. This date would have placed the Exodus some 50 years earlier. But the book of Exodus says that the Israelites had begun their journey to the Promised Land from a city called Pi-Ramesses. This had grown up around a huge palace built by the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II sometime after his enthronement in 1279 BC. It was abandoned after his death 60 years later. Albright also knew that all the archaeological and inscriptional evidence demonstrated that Egypt was firmly in control of Sinai and Canaan for a good century either side of 1400 BC. As Albright's classification of Palestinian pottery became further refined, it also became clear that there was a serious error in Garstang's dating of the burned wall that he had found. Radiocarbon dating showed that the oldest layer was 4,000 years older than Garstang had thought. Garstang's celebrated burned wall proved to be merely another wall of the Middle Bronze Age. The siege that Garstang had excavated had taken place 1,000 years before Saul and David and Solomon. Not the 500 years that the Bible said it should. The dates just didn't fit. Albright had solid evidence that the Israelites were in late Bronze Age Canaan from a stele erected by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, Ramses' 13th son. It is the first reference to Israel outside of the Bible. This inscription, inscribed on a huge rectangular granite block over 3 metres tall, can be dated as precisely as any Egyptian inscription can to 1207 BC. When it was discovered by Flinders Petrie in 1896, it caused a huge sensation. Pharaoh Merneptah gloats, "Canaan has been plundered and every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Giza has been captured. Yenoam made non-existent. Israel laid waste, his seed not." End quote. In this brief mention, Ashkelon, Giza, and Yenoam are listed as cities, but Israel is only a tribe, a people. After Merneptah's inscription, the name Israel does not appear in any non-biblical documents or inscriptions until the time of Solomon's ill-fated son Rehoboam, 350 years later. So the Israelites were in Canaan by 1207 BC. Albright decided to place the Exodus a few decades before, during the reign of Ramses II the Great. It was a reasonable choice, for during the reign of Ramses II, the entire Middle East began to unravel. From the time of Ramses II to 1150 BC, the entire Middle East descended into chaos in an event known as the Bronze Age Collapse, the greatest catastrophe of the ancient world before the fall of Rome, 1700 years later. The Hittite Empire buckled, its capital burnt, never to be reoccupied. Cities throughout Anatolia were destroyed. Many of the Hittite elites seem to have escaped to Syria, for we find clear evidence of Hittite inscriptions and cultural practices centuries later in small states in the northern Levant. These are the Hittites of the Bible. Egypt survived, but lost its coastal empire and would not make imperial overtures in the Levant for centuries. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, its palaces destroyed. The archaeological evidence suggests that almost 90% of its small hamlets and villages were abandoned. Even the knowledge of writing was lost. Cyprus was ravaged. The great metropolis of Ugarit was annihilated. The blackened layer of fire in some places is 2 metres thick and full of arrowheads. Copper and tin, the 2 key but rare components of that most essential manufacture, bronze, the ancient equivalents of today's oil and coal. But they could no longer be bought for love nor money, for the intricate trade routes that had woven together nations from Greece to Egypt to Babylon were no longer travelled. In Canaan, most of the coastal cities from Gaza north were burnt. A little inland, locations we know from the Bible, such as Hatzor, Megiddo, Bethel and Debir, were laid waste. The robust and prosperous city-states were gone. This is the period that the Bible tells us the judges lived in. Long dark centuries for which we have few records. What had caused this disaster? In the early 20th century, it was blamed on the Sea Peoples, who descended on Egypt in 2 massive waves. Not that the Egyptians called them that. They identified many different groups: the Peliset, the Jekka, Shekelesh, Shadana, Danuna, and Weshesh. We don't know where they came from. Perhaps from Sicily and Italy, perhaps from western Anatolia, perhaps from Greece. They skirted the shoreline in ships. They marched down through the coasts of the Levant. The mortuary temple of Ramses III, the pharaoh who eventually defeated them, has fearsome reliefs depicting the ships in their hundreds. These were seriously scary people. Ramses' inscriptions boldly state that no country was able to oppose them, until him, which is probably why he made those claims. The Sea Peoples terrorised the Levant. An especially poignant example is a letter found in the destruction layer at Ugarit from the last king of that city, seeking help from the king in Cyprus. Quote, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of the Hittites, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it, the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." Unquote. Unfortunately for Ugarit, no help arrived, and Ugarit was burned to the ground at the end of the Bronze Age. The great trading city was never reoccupied. Further archaeological investigation shows that the Great Collapse was a montage of horror. Although the evidence is only now emerging, it seems that the Great Drought gripped ancient Greece just before the collapse and took hold in the Levant a generation later. Greece and the eastern Mediterranean also suffered 50 years of destructive earthquakes. Famine became the norm. The Hittites were also coping with numerous internal rebellions. People were looking for food and a house that would not fall down around them. The Sea Peoples may indeed have been as much the victims as the aggressors in this great collapse of civilizations. When the city stopped burning around 1150 BC, the Middle East was a very different place. The last remnant of the Sea Peoples, the Philistines, had established themselves on the coastal plain in southern Canaan. The distinctive patent pottery they left behind clearly shows their Greek and Cretan origins. While the Philistines were building great trading cities on the Mediterranean coast, the inhabitants of Canaan had retreated to the inhospitable highlands. The central highlands, previously empty, were now dotted with tiny villages of a few families, or perhaps a clan each. Of all the Canaanite cities, only a few on the coast survived: Tyre, Sidon and Byblos in Canaan's north. How they survived is an enigma, but survive they did, and thrive they would. The Greeks named these people the Phoenicians, although they probably called themselves something like Canaani. They took up Ugarit's role and became great traders, founding outposts throughout the Mediterranean. Now, how do we know all this? The basic texture of the history of the Middle East is laid down in pottery fragments, artefacts immune to destruction by fire. Pottery types in the many layers in a typical site can be correlated with the pottery found in other layers at other sites. So we can say layer 13 at site A dates to the same time as layer 5 at site B. This gives us a floating chronology. If archaeologists find some tablet saying Pharaoh Ramses III slept here, in layer 13 at site A, they postulate that layer 5 at site B also dates to the time of Ramses III. If it all sounds a bit dodgy, that is because it is. So much can go wrong. Individual layers are usually quite easy to identify. but some layers are centimetres thick, other metres. Perhaps that precious tablet, found at layer 13, was preserved by a grateful innkeeper who lived at layer 10, and who decided to secure his precious memento by burying it deep under his inn. To find out who lived when, and what happened in that when, we have a vast number of chronicles and inscriptions, all of which must be fitted together into a delicate jigsaw puzzle. Prime amongst these are the king lists and chronicles from Egypt, Assyria and Babylon, found on scraps of papyrus and clay tablets. The Turin Papyrus from Egypt gives a list of the kings from the foundation of the kingdom down to the time of Ramses II. Other histories and lists fill in the kings from then until Cleopatra. After decades of argument, historians are pretty sure that they know the succession amongst the complex and overlapping Egyptian dynasties. There are, though, some vocal dissenters who still think we are off by hundreds of years. Their theories have not gained traction. The many tablets and fragments collectively called the Babylonian Chronicles also enable us to construct lists of rulers and key events back to most ancient times. Amongst the latest of these was that of the Greek astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, who preserved a dated list of rulers starting with the Babylonian conqueror of Egypt, Nabonassar, in 747 BC. We have lists aplenty of the rulers of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon and even the Hittites. They can tell us the order of rulers and usually how long they reigned. We have enough synchronisms from treaties and other inscriptions that mention that some Assyrian king was contemporary with some Babylonian king to assemble a solid chronology from 1400 BC onwards. For really detailed chronologies, we rely on the Assyrian Limu lists, which provide a sound chronology back to 1110 BC, about the time of King Saul in the Iron Age. The Assyrians preserved a year-by-year record of kings and events, in which each year was named after the chief official for the year, the Limu. Most Assyrian kings became the Limu in their first year. Some entries also provide information about significant events that occurred and the location of the main Assyrian army. All this information has let us construct a variety of floating or relative chronologies. We can more or less say that King A of Egypt reigned at the same time as King B of somewhere else, as far back as 2300 BC, the early Bronze Age. But now comes the tricky bit. How do we move from all these relative chronologies to actual years? You might think radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating has only been used in the Middle East recently, and has not proved as useful as one might think. If you are arguing about decades, radiocarbon dating is not that useful, but it is grand at establishing the burn layers in destroyed cities to within half a century or so. Radiocarbon dating was instrumental in proving John Garstang's dating of Jericho was wrong, but it has been unhelpful in current arguments about, say, the dating of Solomon's works. For absolute dates, we rely on astronomical data to provide anchors. The Babylonians were devoted astronomers, the first to realise that astronomical events were periodic and could be investigated with mathematics. Their records of eclipses and the rising of the planet Venus provide a few absolute dates that can be tied in with all the other puzzle pieces to date rulers and events to specific years. Unfortunately, the same observations of Venus repeat in 56-year cycles. For the centuries of the Bronze Age, it is unclear to which cycle a given observation belongs. So, for example, the first dates of the reign of Hammurabi of Babylon can be fixed in this manner either as 1848, 1792 or 1736 BC. All these dates are possible, but any dates outside this range don't fit the other synchronisms we have for Hammurabi. Any attempts at absolute dating, of course, go to pieces in the Bronze Age collapse. We reach the firmest ground when the Middle East recovers from the collapse in the early Iron Age, when we have more detailed synchronisms and astronomical observations. The whole dating structure is really held together with string and sellotape, but the string is strong and the sellotape sticky. Of course, there could be surprises from future discoveries, but at the minute we can't worry about that. I'll see you next time on the History in the Bible podcast.